Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and learning what makes people and places tick. Today's stop is Orange in France. This city was established in 35 BCE as a Roman colony and was home of the veterans of the Second Gallic Legion who helped conquer this area for Rome. It's seen waves of conquerors and inhabitants, each of which has left a bit of history behind. We're just entering the Côtes du Rhône area, where you can find Cahteauneuf-du-Pap and many other very nice red and white wines, with prices for almost every budget. So pour yourself a nice glass, kick back, and travel back and forth in time with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide. I took a day trip to Orange from Avignon, but it was actually quite by accident. And let's just say my morning didn't start off great. I had checked the weather forecast, but somehow missed the fine print about wind warning. Perhaps the patent medicine I had gulped down with my coffee dulled my brain enough to miss it. I was coughing, sneezing, and feeling absolutely miserable. I thought it was just allergies, or so I told myself. If you want to hear more about that disaster and my experience with navigating French pharmacies, check out my video, Sick in X. The link is in the description box below. On my way to the bus station, I had my first personal encounter with Mistral, the fierce winds that tear down the Rhone Valley. And let me tell you, they're no joke. One gust was strong enough to snatch the hat right off the top of my head and send it flying into the street. Naturally, like a fool, I ran after it and almost got myself run over in the process. This was not my finest moment. Worse was coming. I snapped this photo a little before 7 a.m. The city dumpsters had been emptied, which made them lighter, and certainly light enough for the wind to toss them around like toys. That should have been my first clue that this was going to be a very windy day. But I was determined not to let the rough start ruin the day. I went to the bus station and hopped on a bus from Avignon to Orange with the plan of changing there and going on to Vaison-la-Romaine. It didn't pan out as planned. I always have a backup plan just in case the primary one falls through, and sometimes I even need a backup for the backup. And today, that backup ended up being Orange. I had wanted to return to the Pont du Gard since 1970. I tried once before on this trip when I was in Nîmes, but my plans were completely derailed by a wildcat bus driver's strike. Thank you very much. This time I figured I could get there from Avignon. There is a bus that takes you straight to the site. That would be perfect, right? Well, not so much. When I got to the bus station, I was informed, or at least I think I was, that while the 8:45 bus to Pont du Gard was running, every other trip for the rest of the day had been canceled because of, you guessed it, more winds. Meaning I could get there, but there was no way back at all, at least not by bus. A taxi might have been an option, but I generally avoid them. On my first trip to France in 1970, I was groped by a taxi driver, and I never really recovered mentally. Yuck! I was not prepared to sleep in the woods. So just like that, my half-century long dream of making it back to Pont du Gard was fatally crushed. It was time for Plan B. Vaison-la-Romaine seemed like a great alternative. It has Roman ruins, a hilltop castle, a lovely medieval city, and even a Roman-era footbridge for me to examine. It wasn't as iconic, at least not to me, as Pont du Gard, but it would have been more than enough to keep me happy and interested since I had never been there. And as it turned out, I still haven't been there. I decided to try for it the next day. At the bus station, I bought my ticket to Orange, where I knew I would have to switch buses. The schedule gave me just 10 minutes to make the connection, but hey, French trains are famously punctual, so I figured the buses would be the same. With my plan in place, I climbed aboard and off we went. Now, I have to tell you, this was some of the most boring scenery imaginable, at least at the beginning. The only thing of any interest that I thought to take a picture of was the carcass of a rusting Concorde, abandoned in a field overgrown with weeds. I knew that Aerospatiale, the company that built the aircraft, had facilities in the area, so I figured maybe this was one of them. Any excitement about that quickly faded as we hit traffic. Really bad traffic. And since this was a school bus route, it made stop after stop. We finally pulled into Orange 12 minutes late. My connection window? Just 10 minutes. Of course I missed the bus. It was time for Plan C, but I had one, and fortunately I don't give up easily. My experience with the regional bus systems earlier had taught me one thing: always have a fallback plan. So Orange was it. Because when life gives you lemons, well, you don't have to make lemonade. Sometimes you get to make orangeade. Let me introduce you to Rimbaud II. French pronounce it just the way we do the movie hero, also known as Rimbaud the Conqueror. He was the Count of Orange in the late 11th century, a time when this region, then known as the Principality of Orange, was a feudal state in Provence. You see him memorialized here in limestone or possibly marble as a medieval knight. He was. Rimbaud joined the First Crusade, which began in 1096. Like many crusaders, his motivation was likely a mix of deep religious conviction combined with the promise of land, titles, and glory. The call to reclaim the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem, was seen as a sacred duty, and participation in the Crusades was believed to earn spiritual merit. There was also plenty of money to be made by the victors, provided only that they survived the trip. Rimbaud was born around 1066 and played a key role in some of the most significant battles of the First Crusade. He was part of the army that laid siege to Antioch, and in 1099, during the siege of Jerusalem, he was one of the first to breach the city walls, along with the more famous Godfrey of Bouillon. For his bravery, Rimbaud is remembered as one of the heroes of Jerusalem, and right here in the town where he was born, he's honored with a statue, a lasting tribute to his legacy. Our visit begins by climbing a really big hill to see a park. This is the Parc Colline Saint-Eutrope, the park on the hill you might call it, a beautiful area that offers stunning views and a lot of history. The hill is composed primarily of limestone, which is characteristic of this region and plays a significant role in shaping both the landscape and the architecture around us. I was wandering through the park, and it reminded me a bit of Federal Hill in Baltimore, though this place feels more tranquil. There are only walkers, children, and tourists like me enjoying the scenery and possibly searching out the overlook for the theater. No one has lived here for centuries. There is an overlook with a fabulous view of that ancient theater, and of course I got lost trying to find it. When I asked a French couple for direction, they were both using canes, they ended up in a spirited debate, most of which I couldn't follow, about which way I should go. The woman was especially animated, and I half expected her to lift up her cane and give her partner a whack. I smiled, thanked them, and moved on as fast as I decently could. This site was occupied continuously from prehistoric times until the end of the 17th century. There were likely Roman fortifications here, which provided a commanding view of the surrounding area. Rimbaud II, we met him at the beginning of our walk, gets credit for building a medieval fortress here, which was strengthened by his heirs. His contributions were, however, vital in expanding and fortifying the territory and established Orange as a significant center in the region. In the 14th century, the princes of Baux, we met that warlike and acquisitive clan during our visit to the now abandoned Les Baux de Provence, constructed a fortress on this site, complete with walls and a donjon, to defend against marauding bands that plagued Provence at the time. By the 17th century, that chateau, which had suffered severe damage during the Wars of Religion, was rebuilt into a formidable citadel. It featured towers and impressively thick walls encircling the hilltop, with walls and more towers leading downhill past the old theater and protecting the city itself, as you can see in this old map. In 1672, the Count of Grignon, acting under orders of Louis XIV, laid siege to the citadel, eventually capturing it and leading to its destruction. I spotted the scattered remains of the castle, which was originally constructed using some of the materials from the Roman-era buildings. I suppose we can consider ourselves lucky that the prince didn't decide to dismantle the theater for building material. While the castle may have been lost to history and was something of a bust from my tourist camera, reaching that viewpoint rewards you with a breathtaking view of the remains of the theater. The Theatre of Orange is one of the best preserved Roman theaters from the imperial era. It was built during the reign of Emperor Augustus and could seat up to 10,000 spectators. It remains an architectural marvel. It also turned out to be a structural surprise, at least to me. When I first saw it from the overlook, or even looking up at it from inside, I thought it had to have been built into that big hill, but I was wrong. This was a freestanding building, shaped rather like a horseshoe and closed at one end by the stage. What happened was that over 2 millennia, mud and dirt washed down from the hill, and the hill itself partially eroded and narrowed the gap between the base of the hill and the back of the seating area. The theater was built near the Roman-era Forum, so it's no surprise that we find some other things just outside its walls. The archway you see here marked the main entrance. From there, patrons were directed to their designated seating tier. We'll talk more about the seating arrangements once we get inside. Nearby, the Romans built a temple, probably in the 2nd century AD, and dedicated it to the Emperor Augustus and his family. There was also a sanctuary, which today looks just like a big hole in the ground, surrounded by houses. This area, which they call the Roman Temple Sanctuary, remains something of a mystery. It was outside the theater, and it may have been part of the sacred precinct linked to performances and possibly dedicated to a local deity, a patron of the arts, or a protective city spirit. No one really knows. Like the Temple of Augustus, it was eventually abandoned as Christianity spread, and, like so many other ancient structures, its stones were repurposed for new buildings. This is one of the best preserved Roman theaters in the world. While Roman-era theaters exist all over Europe, only 3 still have their back walls intact, making this one truly special. Let's take a quick look at its construction. That back wall that you see here is called an acoustic wall. Acoustic walls were partly wooden and sometimes caught fire or collapsed. They were highly decorated, although the decorations were repurposed into homes and civic buildings, and the remaining stone was often mined for building materials. That's why these tended to disappear over time. Like all Roman theaters, this one was modeled after the Theater of Marcellus in Rome, which itself was inspired by a Greek design. There was no roof over the seating area, which meant there were no pillars and no obstructed views. A wooden roof, now replaced, once covered the stage to help improve acoustics and to protect the performers, but it burned down when invaders set fire to the theater. You can still see some fire-damaged stone at the top of the wall. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire was in decline, and Christianity had become the official religion. In 391 AD, the theater was shut down, probably because the performances were deemed to be too extravagant or possibly obscene. Over time, it was abandoned, looted, used as a medieval fortress, and later became a refuge during 16th century religious wars. People bricked up the openings and built homes inside of it. The finely cut stone seats were a goldmine for local builders who eagerly recycled them. This happened all across the former empire, although some structures, like parts of the Colosseum in Rome, were literally too massive to be dismantled. By the 19th century, the theater faced destruction due to urban expansion and neglect. Enter Prosper Mérimée, a writer, historian, and monuments inspector who championed its preservation. His efforts led to its classification as a historical monument, which meant that the local citizenry could not tear it down, securing its future. Today, this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The auditorium here in the theater is truly remarkable and boasted a capacity of around 10,000 spectators. The seating was arranged in 3 tiers. The lower tier, which was for the most important or richest people, the middle seats, and the upper seats, which I think of as the nosebleed section. The layout reflects the hierarchical structure of Roman society. The most privileged peoples were seated in the front rows, closest to the stage. Those privileges were reinforced by the architecture. Unlike modern stadiums, like the Nationals Park in Washington, D.C., where spectators can easily move from the upper levels to better seats, that was not the case here. Once you were assigned a seat, you stayed in your area, as there was no easy way to get between the different sections. Ever eager to capture a better view of the stage than what I had from the park, I decided to climb up the steps through those seats. I imagine that there's a security tape somewhere that caught me moaning, "I hate heights. Gosh, I really hate heights," as I made my way upward. Orange was founded in 35 BC as a settlement for veterans of the Second Gallic Legion who had fought in Caesar's Gallic Wars. Their loyalty to Octavian, who was later called Augustus, secured them a place in Roman history. By 27 or 26 BCE, this was a thriving Roman colony, and a triumphal arch was put up to commemorate its military past. Later on, about 100 years or so, in 26 CE, it was rededicated to the Emperor Tiberius in honor of his victories along the Rhine. This was more than just a monument, though. It was a grand gateway along the Via Agrippa. It was richly decorated with images of trophies, battles, and scenes of Roman triumph. It wasn't defensive. By then, Rome no longer needed walls. A striking carving above the central arch shows a brutal battle. Romans victorious and someone, Gauls or possibly Teutons, lying dead or dying. But Rome's power wasn't always assured. In 390 BCE, a Gallic army had actually invaded the Italian peninsula, sacked Rome, and forced Romans to pay a ransom in gold. When they protested, the Gallic leader threw his sword into the scales and declared, "Woe to the vanquished." Centuries later, in 105 BC, history repeated itself. At the Battle of Orazio, that was the Roman name for present-day Orange, poor leadership led to a catastrophic Roman defeat. Over 120,000 soldiers and camp followers perished. The disaster forced military reforms under a man named Gaius Marius, creating a stronger, more professional army that ultimately crushed the invading tribes. You can read more about him in my WordPress blog. The link is in the description box. But that victory didn't occur in a single battle. The final Roman victory over the Teutons in Gaul occurred at the Battle of Aquae Sextiae in 102 BCE. Under the command of Gaius Marius, the Roman army defeated them and their allies near modern-day Aix in Provence, which we visited in an earlier tour. The battle was part of a larger war which Rome fought against migrating Germanic and Celtic tribes. After their defeat at Aquae Sextiae, the remaining forces were crushed the following year in a battle at Vercellae in 101 BCE in northern Italy, marking the final victory in the war. The arch tells the story of a battle, but it's a generic story. The outcome is clear. The Gauls, or whoever, lay dead or captured, and their weapons were being displayed as trophies. This arch wasn't just a monument, it sent a message. It was a reminder that Rome was in charge. Did the Romans believe their empire would last forever? Perhaps, but history would prove later, even Rome could fall. There was some kind of a church on this site, the Cathedral of Notre Dame of Nazareth here in Orange, going back to the 4th century. Today, it's just a parish church, but its history as a cathedral means it's a rather ritzy local church. We know surprisingly little about what happened on this site before the 4th century, but we can make an educated guess. In Roman cities, the Forum was always a central public square, and it was often surrounded by important buildings like temples, basilicas, law courts, and administrative office. As Roman power faded and Christianity became more common, medieval churches and cathedrals were constructed on or near the site of these former Roman ruins, often reusing the materials and taking advantage of existing foundations. The cathedral is located within the historic quarter of Orange, where Roman-era structures such as the theater and triumphal arch still stand nearby. This suggests that it was built in an area of prior Roman significance. The cathedral was designed in what's called Provençal Romanesque style and had thick walls, round arches, and simple decoration. Over time, it was redecorated to add Gothic and Baroque touches, particularly in its interior decoration and chapels. Unfortunately, much of that was lost during the French Revolution. Like many churches in France, it was desecrated, and much of the original artwork and decoration had been lost forever. For a while, it even served as something called the Temple of Reason, but was eventually restored as a church and remained an important religious site here in Orange, but no longer as a cathedral. Cathedrals always serve as the seat of a bishop, and the building lost its status when the Diocese of Orange merged with the Diocese of Avignon. There was more to see in Orange, but mostly it was atmospheric, narrow, winding medieval street with plenty of shops. I'm not much of a shopper, and I was on a deadline to catch the train back to Avignon. And what I thought were allergies, I actually had walking pneumonia, was making me absolutely miserable. So after the cathedral, I called it a day. And so should we, but not before some refreshments, which I didn't get there. All I really wanted to do was curl up with some allergy medicine. You and I have the chance to do better. Orange is located in the Rhône Valley, a region known for producing some of the world's most celebrated wines. The most famous of these is probably Cahteauneuf-du-Pap. There are plenty of other Rhône Reds, and they are available at palatable prices. You might wonder how a world-famous wine got named after a pope's home. Cahteauneuf-du-Pap, which translates as Newcastle of the Pope, got its name from its historical connection to the papacy. Pope Clement V, who was a Frenchman, moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon in 1309 due to the political instability and violence in Rome. At the time, Rome was unsafe and chaotic, with constant conflicts between powerful local families. Avignon was controlled by the French crown and offered a far more stable and secure environment for the Pope. This move, which began a period which is known as the Avignon Papacy, lasted until 1377, when Pope Gregory XI returned the papacy to Rome. Clement's successor, Pope John XXII, was another Frenchman. He built a summer residence in the nearby village, which became known as Cahteauneuf-du-Pap. He probably picked the area because it had a somewhat nicer climate, peaceful surroundings, and it was close enough to Avignon to be easily accessible. The new house provided a comfortable place for the Pope to escape the pressures of the papal court during the warmer months. This was actually fairly common among the popes of the Avignon Papacy, who had multiple properties for different purposes, such as relaxation, administrative work, and even a spiritual retreat. At the time, however, Avignon was not completely free of threats. The bubonic plague was ripping through France. Orange is located farther from the major trade routes and cities where the plague had a more direct path of entry, especially when the disease was spread via merchants and military movement. Avignon, being an important papal seat and the center of political and religious activity, was exposed to such trade and travel. The name stuck, and the wines, Cahteauneuf-du-Pap among them, are among the most prestigious in France. So you might say that the wine, one of the most famous of the Rhone Reds, got its name from the papal equivalent of a home near the Jersey Shore. Come back next time for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide and host.